Hi there. Now let's talk a little bit about correlational research as well as other types of research design. So you're probably familiar a bit with correlational research. You'll certainly hear more about it in your research methods as well as your statistics classes. But here's the notion. Sometimes variables, that is uh, measures basically, that can vary in one way or another, kind of track together. That is, they're related in some way. As one goes up, the other goes up, or as one goes up, the other goes down, etc. And that's what we mean by a correlation. So here's an example. We noticed, of course, that as taller people tend to weigh more, and people who weigh more tend to be taller. Now, it's not perfect. Every once in a while, you'll find a short person who weighs a whole lot, or a tall person who weighs a whole little. But on the other hand, they tend to go up in general. That is, they are positively correlated. So here you can see, of course, as height goes up, let's look at somebody who's pretty darn tall. Let's imagine they're up here. They also have a tendency to weigh a lot here. As one goes up, the other goes up. Now, these correlations can vary between 0, well, actually I should say -1 and 1. Here's an example of a negative score. This is called a negative correlation. That is, as altitude goes up, temperature tends to go down. So if you go up to Flagstaff, for example, or places like that, you'll go up in altitude, up around 7,000 feet or so, maybe even higher, and you'll notice that temperature will kind of go down. So that's a negatively correlated variable. So in this particular case, the relationship between altitude and temperature would be less than 0. That is, it might be, who knows, -0.56. It would never be less than -1. -1 would be a perfectly perfectly negative correlation. Positive 0.1 would be a positive correlation, and perfect correlation. So it varies between those two things. If there's no correlation at all, well, then that's considered a 0 correlation. So hopefully that helps a little bit understanding that particular situation. We should mention, of course, that just because one thing increases as the other increases, or as one thing decreases as the other increases, it doesn't mean it's causing it. It just means there's a relationship between it. So that's when people say that it does not imply causality. Correlation does not imply causality. Sometimes there is a causal relationship, but sometimes there isn't. Here's an example. It turns out that as the amount of ice cream sales increases, so does the frequency of homicide. So, well, that's weird, right? People are eating more ice cream and people are dying more frequently, or actually getting killed more frequently. Well, why would that be? Well, the main reason is there's a third variable here that's causing both of these things. That is, summertime, for example, people come into contact with each other much more often. They're outdoors and things like that, doing things and so forth, so they're interacting a lot more with other human beings. It's also hot during that period of time. Well, hot is the perfect time, summer, for example, to eat ice cream, but apparently it's also an okay time. That's not the way I want to say it. It's also a time of year that increases frequency of homicide. So it's not the case that ice cream causes people to kill people more frequently. It's actually the case that summertime or warm weather has a tendency to increase both of those things. So now let's imagine we want to really understand causation. Okay, we've understood that, one thing seems to correlate with another, but does it really cause it? That would be nice for us to find out. So experiments enable us to control the effects of variables that we're not interested in, things like season, for example. And this enables us to discover the causal relationships between variables. So here's one of the ways I like to think about this. You can sort of think about every experiment could be described as the effect of X on Y. So, the effect of, oh gosh, I don't know, the effect of morphine on sleep, the effect of, any number of other things, early childhood education on SAT score. All of those kinds of things are important. So you're trying to look at the effect of one thing, what we call X, on another thing, what we call y. Each of those are variables, that is, they can have different levels associated with them, or they vary on some measure. In that case, the effect of x on y, x is the variable that the researcher can change in the experiment. So for example, they can change the concentration or the volume of morphine that, say, a rat gets, or a person in some particular cases. That is called the independent variable. Y is the variable that might be changed by modifying x. In this particular case, it might be hours of sleep, for example, again, in the morphine and sleep relationship. That is the dependent variable. So every experiment can be described as the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. I think it's important that you begin to remember and keep in mind what is the independent variable. That's the thing that you're able to change as a researcher. You can affect that directly. Again, the amount of morphine you might give a person or a rat or something else. On the dependent variable, that is the thing that might be affected by the modification you make. That is the amount that that person or that rat might sleep. So here's an example of what we call a two-conditioned controlled experiment. Remember, I mentioned that one of the important parts about experiments is they can be controlled. That is, we're interested in studying one particular change and we want to leave everything else the same. So imagine you were able to go off and get a random representative sample of research participants. And you assigned one to an experimental group. They're going to get whatever treatment it is that we're talking about. Once again, imagine it's the administration of morphine. And then you also have a control group, and people get randomly assigned to those. So through a lottery system or a random number generator or something of that sort. So half the people go in the experimental group, half go in the control group. Then these are the kind of situations they get. So basically this group, everything is the same here. All of these other kinds of variables are the same. Where they get their medication, all of those kinds of things are the same. The control group might get injected instead of with morphine, they might get injected with a saline solution of some kind. This group, there's an independent variable, which is morphine versus saline solution, and then we measure their effect on the dependent variable, the same one, which is sleep. Sometimes there are variables that sneak their way in and end up kind of confusing the relationship or the situation between the independent and dependent variable. So that's called the confounding variable. That is, these are variables that you're not interested in studying at all, but sometimes still affect the dependent variable because you didn't, control for it. An example of that is seasonality, for example, confounds the relationship between ice cream sales and murder. So you would have to sort of make sure you're looking at perhaps those two situations within the same season. You would have to control for seasonality. And in fact, the real key to good experimental design is just figuring out how to remove all those little extraneous variables. Really think it through so that you know that the only thing that's changing, as far as you can tell, is the change that you're purposely making, the difference between the independent variable or levels of the independent variable, and then you're looking at the effect on the dependent. So there's a couple designs that are probably often used that are worth mentioning here. So let's start with two of them. Let's start with the first one, the two-condition experiment. Imagine we were interested in understanding time to find and select a target item in a menu system, a piece of software, for example. Well, we can have shallow menu structures, that is, where they have lots of sort of selections, and it's only too deep in an information architecture. Or we can have a deep menu structure, where perhaps there are fewer choices to make at each level, but you might have to go to 4 levels, for example, before you make your final choice. Well, which one's better? Well, for performance and efficiency, we might be interested in looking at time, just to see which one's better. We might not even pay attention right now to preference or emotion or anything like that. Let's just focus on one thing. and say it's time. Well, we could compare those two things. We come up with one prototype that's 2 levels deep, one prototype that's 4 levels deep, and we just compare one against the other in terms of the amount of time it takes to find and select the target. Here's a multiple condition experiment. Maybe we have 3 levels of this particular structure. That is, we have the shallow menu that's 2 levels. We have the deep menu that's 4. Maybe we toss in an intermediate one, which is 3 levels. So that enables us to compare 3 different types of prototypes here. That would be a multiple condition experiment. And then finally, we might be interested in how these interact with the number of items that we're choosing from. So again, we're trying to find a particular target item, and if it's amongst 32 items, well, maybe that might make sense for a shallow menu structure, whereas if there are 96 items, maybe we might need a deeper structure for something like that. Well, in that case, we could have several different types of items, in this case 9, so we would have 9 different menus, similar in every other way, if possible, except for their menu structure. And we would have people try to find items. We would keep track of the time required to find the target, and we would fill in each of these cells. This gives us a number of nice things. For one, we could then compare 2 levels versus 3 levels versus 4 levels. We would be able to see their times down here, just averaging across all of these items. We'd also be able to tell, well, which one is fastest. Is it selecting a target from 32 items versus 64 versus 96? I would anticipate it would be selecting a target among 32 items because there's fewer selections out there. And then we would also even be able to look at the relationship between these things, so what we often call an interaction. And an interaction would be exactly what I described before. Maybe shallow menu structures are really great for using a small number of items, but deeper menu structures are better for using a larger number of items. So if somebody were to ask you, in that case, which is better, a shallow menu structure versus a deep menu structure, you would have to answer, well, that depends. It depends on how many menu items there are. So that's the real issue with interactions. In order to answer a question about interactions, it's almost always it depends, and it really depends on things like this. Okay. Another thing that you're going to run into time and time again is the difference between subject studies and within subject studies, or sometimes between subjects and within groups, they'll refer to it. So let's look at this. A between subject study is when different groups of participants are assigned to each level of the independent variable. So in this particular case, if we went back here, we would have one group of participants in this shallow menu structure, 32 menu items, and we would have a different group in this situation, and yet a different group in this situation. So we would have different participants. That would be a between subjects variable. Each group of participants is placed in one condition or another. A within subjects condition would be something like this. If we went back here and we had participant 1 do find a target in this level first, and then participant 1 then find it in this level second, and then they would go through and do it again in this level third, that would be an example of within subjects. That is, the same participant is participating in multiple conditions of the independent variable. Now when you do that, of course, you have to counterbalance which ones they see first. So participant 1 might see they might see this first, followed by that second, followed by that third. But participant 2 might see this first, followed by this one second, and this one third. So you're kind of changing the order in which different participants receive conditions. And that's to make sure that learning doesn't happen in one condition that improves or even sometimes makes worse performance in the next condition. That gives you a very brief introduction to quantitative research. I think mainly what I wanted you to understand was the difference between qualitative research and quantitative research, and also understand that these things, it's not that one is better than the other. I remember when I first started out in research, I had a friend who was doing a lot of qualitative work, and I thought, well, if it's qualitative, it's not really research. And of course I was wrong about that. Instead, what his qualitative research was doing often was uncovering a lot of things that we might not get otherwise, but usually had to be subjected to quantitative research to really test the validity of what they found in the qualitative. So these two things go together. There's not one that's better than the other, etc. It's just that one can be quantified, assign numbers and so forth, where the other often is for, uncovering, let's say, so things you notice, uncovering observations, that kind of information.